I'm the artistic leader of the Stockholm Music Festival, and I'm very happy today to wish welcome to our colleagues in the Royal Academy of Music that will present a very exciting seminary, Sounding Academy, about the Swedish opera from the 18th century that we plan to stage next year, open air here in the old town of Stockholm. So I say no more and give the word to President Susanne Rydén, please. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's never too late for early music, and certainly not today. A warm welcome to everyone who is following us online and to the precious audience here in Storkyrkosalen in Stockholm. It's fantastic to have this opportunity to actually have a small live audience, and we hope that you will all, wherever you are, will feel included. We are heading back in time to the second half of the 18th century Stockholm today, a time of cultural and political ferment, a time in Sweden which some even refer to as a cultural revolution. A hybrid of foreign influence together with the first flowerings of nationalism in the fine arts. And called back home from France, Gustav III became the new king of Sweden in 1771, the king which the same year founded the Royal Swedish Academy of Music, the king which is known to the history as the Theatre King. We have a very exclusive and well-informed panel with us today, and it's my great pleasure to welcome Petra Dotlachelova, theatre and dance scholar, specialized in the 18th century costumes, and currently are also our Academy's Bernadotte scholar, Bernadotte stipendiat. And next to her we have Jenny Nell, a senior lecturer and researcher at the Department of Culture and Aesthetics at Stockholm University. And among other things, there is a long list for Jenny. There is also, she's also the president of the Gustavus III Society. On my right-hand side is Magnus Tessing-Schneider with a PhD, and is a research scholar in theatre studies at the same Department of Culture and Aesthetics here at the Stockholm University. Welcome, Magnus. And last but not least, we have Mark Tatlow, which we know also in many various shapes as a musician, an opera conductor, formerly also the artistic director at Drottningholm and a professor at the University of Opera Studies here in Stockholm. And he is also currently writing his PhD dissertation at the Academy of Music and Drama at the Gothenburg University. And my name is Susanne Rydén. I'm the president of the Royal Swedish Academy of Music and a former early music singer. And I look forward to being your guide the following 70 minutes. We are not only going to talk, of course there is going to be music. And let's start with music. From the comedy ballet, that's how we'd like to describe it, Birger Jarl. And we will hear the first of two instrumental pieces from the beginning of the Divertissement, Très Légère in G major. And in the original libretto, we read that the following actions accompany the music. We have Cupid dances, shoots an arrow at the queen, and then runs to embrace her. The Graces prevent him, binding him with flowers. They carry him to the feet of the queen, where he lays down his quiver and bow. Please. think we should applaud them.
Yeah.
And the musicians we are applauding is Elin Gabrielsson and Emma Nyman on violin, Monica Carlén viola, and Mime Yamahiro Brinkman on the cello. And I certainly did not miss the winds, although that this piece originally had a full orchestra setting. But that is, I think, also one of the fantastic things about early and Baroque music, that you can actually take what you have at hand and get a fantastic performance. Thank you very much. Right, we have heard some music. Now, Jenny, would you like to describe the musical life in Stockholm in the time when we first could hear this music?
I will try in 8 minutes. Well, we can say that musical life in Stockholm in the 1770s was changing radically. Ever since the so-called father of Swedish music, Roman, pioneered public concerts in Stockholm in 1731, musical events were commonplace, and both public and private concerts constituted a breeding ground for experimentation and development. And when Gustavus became king in 1771, it was a time of cultural and political change. And Gustavus himself contributed to that change, both on the level of institution, founding the Royal Academy of Music, obviously, in 1771, building a national Swedish opera, creating new fixed stages for theater and music, but also with a firm, hands-on approach as librettist, as stage director, as costume designer, as set designer, and also as choreographer. So with Gustavus's parents, King Adolphus Frederick and Louisa Ulrika, there was a rising interest in opera in Sweden. Touring opera companies from Italy and France found their way to Stockholm. And in the spring of 1755, an Italian opera company came to Stockholm, and with them the composer Francesco Ottini. He came from Bologna and had already established a brilliant career at home. And the troupe performed successfully at Drottningholm with an opera by Ottini, who then chose to stay in Sweden for the rest of his life. He served as royal court conductor for 20 years, and together with Gustavus III, he founded the seedlings of Gustavian opera. Ottini composed the first opera with Swedish text, Thetis and Pelé, in 1773, but ultimately found himself pushed to the side by new, more flexible talents from Germany, such as Naumann and Krauss, coming in Sweden at the end of the 1770s, when the king had failed to convince Salieri to settle in Sweden. So despite the fact that Stockholm had a long tradition of importing, so to speak, foreign performers and composers and mixing them with local talents, there was no Swedish opera to speak of at the time. When Gustavus III came to power in 1771, he set out to change all that. In less than 1 year, he fired his parents' French troupe and started building a Swedish national opera. Most researchers agree that the impetus came from his stay in Paris as crown prince in 1770 and 1771, when he was subjected to new forms of theater and musical theater. By own admission, the king was not overly fond of the very popular genre opera comique. He favored serious drama with elements of pleasant and engaging music. Well-integrated ballet set against well-painted scenery and with brilliant costumes. The thought being that all senses should be satisfied simultaneously. This was the foundation for the creation of the opera Thetis and Pelé in 1773 in collaboration with Ottini. It was a complete success and was followed by the introduction of 2 new genres, pasticcio, and also in the case with Birger Jarl, drama with music. A new emerging genre that later became the genre of choice for some of Gustavus III's bigger operas in the 1780s. So Gustavian opera was indeed, as stated by the king himself, to be something new, something never seen before. That was his prerogative. True, Gustavus usually drew inspiration from numerous sources, from the continent, German, French, and Italian mostly. But there was never a question of imitation, slavish imitation, or just mere translations of pre-existing works. It was intended to challenge and rival the original, and even supersede the common or more well-established operatic styles such as the opera comique, the opera buffa, opera seria. Obviously, new forms created debate over such things as content and structure. What would it be like? We can even see in the sources, such as letters and diaries, that Gustavus himself welcomed and indeed encouraged debate on the topic. Already in 1773, he tried, unsuccessfully, to gear the dramaturgy towards the guidelines of Gluck, of which he was familiar from his time in Paris. But it wasn't until 1779, with the help of the author Johan Henrik Källgren, that the king could push the debate on opera aesthetics in the so-called public press of the day, the Stockholm newspapers. The king, through Källgren, championed Gluck, whose opera reform tried to integrate song, music, and dance into a whole, and making the libretto a dramatic force for the opera, a sort of total operatic production, which was a movement going on in the continent at this time. It was a huge effort from the king that made the Swedish opera reform possible. Not only did he scour the country for local talents, he imported talents from abroad. He supported them financially. He sent them to the continent to observe the latest styles, the latest practices, to develop their own proficiency under different maestros, often of their own choice. He also involved himself personally. He decided which works should be produced, but simultaneously he did not try to impose his personal taste, but encouraged originality. He was a master at recognizing talent, at blending Swedish performance with foreign ones, and creating a truly international troupe who performed Swedish content in the Swedish language. And Gustavus himself was a prolific writer, a master of style both in Swedish and French. And his goal with the National Swedish Opera was to surpass the then so famous Gluck, who was sort of the fixating point for him as he had met and seen in Paris, when it came to plot and when it came to character. That was two things he really wanted to develop. And it's fair to say that he did. Moving away from the Gluckian way of basing the plots and figures from classical mythology, Gustavus focuses on psychological probings into human situations, human characters. Granted, these humans are often royals. That was, after all, the world he knew. But he often focuses on personal hardship and sacrifices. Personal sacrifice in the name of duty, a concept he himself was all too familiar with. Also, Gustavus was a highly visual person. Looking at his designs and his drafts for plays, one notices that he has a very distinct mind for scenography, stage direction, theatrical machinery, effects, and, as I said, even choreography. Even though many plots were loosely based on predominantly French models, the subject is usually chosen from Swedish history, and he places Swedish and Nordic characters in Swedish settings. At the same time, comic opera became popular, so much so that it rivaled the more serious productions that he staged at the Royal Opera. So even the king himself wrote a couple of comedies and allowed for many different writers to experiment with genre and style. So by the end of the 1780s, the inhabitants of Stockholm had access to a wide variety of musical and theatrical entertainment. And it is a long-lived myth, I should say, that Gustavus had no interest in music whatsoever. There are a lot of people who say this. The Countess Digmont complains in a letter that Gustavus does not like music, and there are other comments also by himself saying he doesn't particularly like music. And it is often said that it was his brother, Charles, and his sister, Sophia Albertina, who were the musical ones in the family. But it is clear from research made by, for instance, Marie-Christine Skunke, Anna Ivarsdotter, Agne Beijer, Bertil van Boer, Gunnar von Proschwitz, and others. I can mention a whole line. And also, if you look at his own letters, his own drafts, you can see that the king indeed had an interest in music. Just studying the letters he sent home from Paris in the early 1770s shows that he frequently commented on musical theater. Interestingly enough, he often views music in relation to text and also to the performance. It is also clear from the letters that he didn't like music such as in a person coming in, singing an aria and then leaving. that did not engage his senses. He wanted to see everything in collaboration. So perhaps instead we should say that sort of plain musical performances and plain instrumental performances did not interest him. And perhaps that has to do with his very visual persona. And that is why opera and the genre drama with song suited him perfectly. The simultaneous stimuli of all senses. Sort of a Gesamtkunstwerk. That was what interested him, engaged him, and drove him to try out new paths. The seeds to this larger project we can see already in today's piece in Birger. I will leave it to Magnus to tell you more about this drama with song, this comédie ballet. Suffice for me to give you the context and explain the king's involvement. The piece was conceptualized as, for the wedding of his brother Jarl to Hedvig Elisabeth Charlotte of Holstein. The celebrations were lavish and fiercely criticized, but the political implications was that Gustavus did not have any children at this time. So the wedding was important, very important, in securing the line of succession. So the king used a model in Voltaire's La Princesse de Navarre, also written for a royal wedding, but the model is used very loosely indeed. There are significant reworkings in the frame story and partly also in the music. I will leave that up to other people to talk about. And they thought themselves that they tried to elevate the genre. That was the main idea. The more farcical elements have been dropped, and the king had worked together a more serious and dignified, I would say, frame story with so-called jolly and playful interludes, which is the divertissement. It is clear that the reworkings are substantial. The king has removed and added new scenes, introduced more dance numbers, more song elements, and he refers constantly in the drafts to particular musical pieces to be used, and the draft also shows his eye for scenery, the visual. There are detailed instructions on stage movements, choreography, even down to certain dance steps. He insists that they use pas de quatre. And he even instructed the dance master himself, Galoudier, who was responsible for the choreography of the dance part. So he personally instructed him. So all in all, Birger Jarl took form as a patchwork of borrowed elements, ballet pantomime elements, and scattered musical pieces. But in the hands of Gustavus and his collaborators, it morphed into a completely new composite work based on new, still budding aesthetics that came to form what is now known as Gustavian opera. Thank you.
Thank you. This awakes so many questions, and we will continue to explore. But I think it's so. You used the expression patchworks, and that is somehow the. I mean, here we have the lust of experimentation. So you can say that it almost merges into this piece, and here we have all the various tryouts.
It is very experimental, this piece.
Well, it would have been very exciting to be part of that experiment. I think it's also very interesting, this myth that he was not interested in music when he's obviously so involved in the music in so many ways. And yeah, I mean, let's talk a little about then, Magnus, about the shape. I mean, here we have a historical figure, Birger Jarl, supposedly founding Stockholm in the 13th century, who is then put as a human character somehow in this play 500 years later, and giving the title. It's very obvious that that should be the case after hearing what you have told us. And then Uttini composing for the Swedish language in this time, just freshly arriving in this country. Yeah, would you like to introduce us a little bit to Uttini and to the comedy ballet, because that's what we are talking about, isn't it?
Yes, I will try. He was not completely new to Stockholm, though.
No.
Uttini, well, he was, as we've already heard, a central figure in the early history of Swedish opera. In 1774, he was 50 years old. Birger was actually performed the day after his 50th birthday. And he had a long career as an opera composer behind him that had taken him far from his native Bologna. He had written around 10 Italian operas, most of them on librettos by Pietro Metastasio, for various Italian theatres and for the theatres of Hamburg, Copenhagen and Drottningholm Palace. And during the 1760s, he had written the music for King Adolf Frederick's French acting company, who performed at the Ball House Theatre just around the corner here. It stood right across the royal palace. When Gustav III succeeded his father as king in 71, he immediately dismissed the French acting company as one of his first decisions. Intent on promoting opera sung in Swedish and aiming to purify the Swedish language through the creation of a national operatic system that combined Italian and French traditions. The ballets and choruses characteristic of French opera should be combined with the melodious charm of Italian opera. Uttini, who had spent 18 years in Stockholm, had never learned Swedish properly, they said. But since he was the only experienced opera composer in Stockholm, it was decided that he should write the music for the first grand opera in Swedish, Thetis och Pili, Thetis and Peleus, that we have heard about. He committed himself wholeheartedly to the project and began improving his knowledge of the Swedish language. And Thetis or Pele, with which the Royal Swedish Opera was inaugurated in 1973, became the most successful work he ever wrote. A French observer wrote after the premiere that the music is sweet and touching, and the Swedish language is very well suited to it. One of the tunes was used by Carl Michael Bellman as a setting for 3 different poems, as the Bellman scholar John Massengale has recently shown. Gustav III may have found it quite appropriate that the first Swedish opera should be written by an Italian, since his primary role model was Louis XIV of France, the Sun King, who had laid the foundations of French opera exactly 100 years earlier with the help of another Italian, the Florentine composer Giovanni Battista Lully, better known as Jean-Baptiste Lully. And so we find the following invocation in the preface to Thetis et Pele, which may have been owing to Gustav himself. May the era of King Gustav III become for Sweden what the era of Louis XIV became for France, when its genius first began to approach the summit from which it now seems to beckon us to run after it. And so Gustav III wanted to run after that spirit. Indeed, Gustav chose the myth of Thetis and Peleus as the subject of the first Swedish opera because that had been the subject of one of the first operas performed in Paris in 1654, when the 15-year-old Louis XIV had impressed his countrymen with his dancing in 6 different roles in that opera. As we heard before, also the libretto for Thetis et Pele was based on a French libretto also from the court of the Sun King by Fontenelle. In the words of Axel von Fersen the Elder, who was critical of the king, Gustav III had the weakness always to want to follow in the footsteps of that powerful and glorious French king, the Sun King. No doubt Gustav III's idolization of the court culture of Louis XIV was influenced by Voltaire. The famous philosopher described that age as the most enlightened age there ever was, the court of Louis XIV. And he declared that Europe owed its politeness, its politesse, and its social spirit, l'esprit de société, to the court of Louis XIV. These values had been taught to the French subjects through the institutions that the king founded, the Royal Academy of Music in France and the Paris Opera, and Gustav III now aimed to teach the same values to his subjects through equivalent institutions, all the academies he founded, including the Royal Swedish Academy of Music and the Stockholm Opera. Birger Jarl, which premiered the year after Tétis Opélé in 1774, marked a further attempt to imitate the dramatic forms of the court of Louis XIV and adapt them to the Swedish context. Written for the wedding of the king's brother, as we heard, this play deals with the 13th century de facto ruler of Sweden and founder of Stockholm, Birger Jarl, and the way he assumes a false identity as a knight in order to win the Dowager Queen of Denmark, Mechthild of Holstein. The libretto, however, which Gustav III described as a comédie ballet in his manuscript draft, was based on a comédie ballet by Voltaire, again, from 1745. And Voltaire's piece, in turn, was an imitation of the comédie ballet written for the Sun King's court in the previous century, most of them with music by Rydén. So again, there were these echoes of the 17th century. The comédie ballet as a genre was invented by Molière, and it is a spoken play with a simple action, often centering on a marriage, that is interrupted by these spectacular musical interludes, the divertissement, that involve both dancing and singing. Molière's comédie ballets are often comical and contemporary, but Voltaire's and also Birger Jarl are historical, placed in the Middle Ages. Birger Jarl has 4 divertissements, and most of the music had been composed or adapted by Uttini. In Act 1, we first see Venus, Cupid, and the 3 Graces trying to persuade Mechthild, who is watching, to give in to the entreaties of the unknown knight, who is really Birger Jarl in disguise. And 2 scenes later, a group of Sami soothsayers arrived to predict the loving union of the couple with a Sami drum and a ballet of laps. And the music we heard before was taken from one of the first of these divertissements, which was read aloud. In Act 2, Birger Jarl has a small pastoral opera, Eglé, performed before Mechthild on a stage on the stage, which is about Apollo, the sun god, who assumes the identity of a shepherd in order to woo a shepherdess. So in that way, it is an allegorical reflection of the action of the play, where Birger Jarl woos Mechthild disguised as a knight. Eglé was actually a French opera from 1748 by the rather unknown Pierre de la Garde, the music teacher of this French royal family, that had been translated into Swedish and incorporated into the Swedish opera, and been adapted also by the local composer Henrik Philip Jonsson, the former musical director of the French acting company. And Birger Jarl finally concludes with a grand divertissement in which the union of Birger Jarl and Mechthild and of the Duke and Duchess of Södermanland watching in the audience is celebrated by a group of courtiers and peasants from different Swedish provinces. And we will hear more about those from Petra.
Yes, thank you, Magnus. Yeah, I mean, are you following the story? It's quite complicated, isn't it? Here we have imitations, we have echoes from the past, we have all these various ingredients and influences, and we know the interest in all of these ingredients from Gustavus III. And Petra, I mean, certainly a play, a drama, a performance in this time, it's hard to imagine it without any kind of dancing, right?
Yes.
Yeah. How? Tell us a little bit. How does dancing appear? What importance does it have?
Yeah, ballet was really indeed at this time an integral part of opera, but also in plays. Although already since mid-18th century there started this demands and also development of ballet as an independent form. So it's like emancipation of ballet. So personalities in Europe like Jean-Georges Noubert or Gaspar Vangelini or others created ballets that were independent with their own story. But for this, Sweden had to wait just a little longer. So in this piece in Birger, Jarl, as we said, it's a comedy ballet. It was also called comedy ballet. Dance was integral part of the happening, of the narrative. Dance emphasizes often in operas and also develops like emotions that are happening in the story or the mood of the scenes. So as we heard in the first act, there are dancing pleasures and games. So these embody really the playful or romantic atmosphere of seduction. And
Suitable
then,
for a wedding.
Yes.
Yeah.
But then we have also the Sami soothsayers, and they, with their drums and some kind of whirling dancing probably, there was like some circles, there must be some kind of mysterious tones in it. So there could be also darker tone in dances, and dance could also really evoke terror and fear. Not here, but in other operas you have like furies and demons that are really evoking this fear in the audiences.
So that would be the Swedish equivalent then of creating fear by putting the Samis in this. I mean,
maybe there was something mysterious, I think, about this
just the mysterious
entrance.
Yeah.
Yes, and finally, of course, dance also embodies happiness and joy, and that we have in the last act. And here it is represented by a variation of folk dances. I will just talk a little bit after about that. So what and how were they dancing? This course suggests various well-known dance forms popular at the period of the 18th century, such as minuet, which was also performed as a ballroom dancing, but also was popular on stage. We have passe-pied, and then we have also more theatrical forms of dance, like gavotte or tambourin. But unfortunately, the actual choreographies were not preserved. We have like suggestions from Gustav III, who was more like organizing the groups. So he was suggesting the groupings like paregator, so it's dance of four, but not sure about like the actual steps were probably created by Rydén, who was the ballet master, and maybe also by the dancers, the solo dancers, who often also were kind of authors of their entrances. And aside from the dance form that I just mentioned, there was the dance genre was also imported quality, and the performers actually specialized in them. So there was serious genre, demi-caractère, and comic, and some also distinguished grotesque genre. So the serious genre was considered the most noble, the highest, but by 1770s also a little bit like old-fashioned. So Galaudier, who was a serious dancer, was like, he's a great choreographer, has very nice attitudes, considering this is not very popular anymore. That was comments over the time. So in these genres performed characters, it was always linked to characters, like noblemen, women, knights that we have here, ancient Greeks and Romans in other instances, and gods and allegories. It was distinguished by this very controlled and sustained almost movement, and these graceful attitudes, as they call it, and long balances and everything. So that was considered the most difficult and the most beautiful. The demi-caractère was certainly the most popular at the time. This was more lively, but still graceful and elegant. And the word voluptuous is also very often connected to this genre, and especially when women are dancing. So characters like shepherdess and shepherds and nymphs and other pleasurable allegories, like we have the games and the pleasures, could perform in this genre. Then we have comic style, which require much more of character. So often there's like also really character genre and style, which could like movement-wise include more extreme positions, gestures of legs, gestures of arms that were higher jumps or even stomps, bendings of the body as much as the corset allows, and even, as they call it, ungraceful elements, so which would go towards this kind of folkish style of movement. And yes, characters like peasants and sailors, often drunk sailors, could dance in this style. But the dancers were also skillful actors, and ballets often included at this pantomimic action. We have already heard here about the Cupid, Graces, and the soothsayers, so there was certainly much more than just dancing. So in Birger Jarl, all of the 30 dancers of the newly established ballet company performed. There were 21 men and 9 women, and they were both French and Swedish. The French dancers were often returning or former members of the former French company, and the Swedish were often like new pupils of Galaudier, and also Utini's son was dancing in it. He was the second dancer, probably in kind of serious style. And the choreography was created by ballet master Galaudier, as I said. He has been in Stockholm for quite a long time already, and he would be the longest serving ballet master in the history of Swedish ballet, more than 30 years. And as said, he closely following Gustav III instructions. And he also performed. He performed 3 roles. Since he was a serious dancer, he performed as a knight, as a nobleman, and as a soothsayer, one of the soothsayers. Then we had soloist Louis Fossard and his wife Marie-Jeanne, who were also members of the former company, and they were specialized in character dancing, and they were also very much praised for their pantomime. So we can imagine them as like creators maybe of the pantomimic actions. Among other soloists, there was Mr. Ockeberry, probably the mi-caractère, who was dancing the Cupid, so a new dancer. Then we have serious dancer Elisabeth Soligny, French, who was one of the Graces, also lady of the court, so in the serious. And there was also one of the Graces, rising star Mademoiselle Slotsberry, Swedish dancer, who was then only 13 years old. Yes, and each of the dancers danced more than one time, so they had 2 or 3 roles during the performance, so it was quite demanding. They also had to change costumes, so it was a lot of action for the 30 people in the company during the performance. Yes, and as we already said, perhaps the most important part from the choreographic point of view, and maybe in the costumes, were these folk dances, where the music seems to be inspired by actual folk tunes. Mark will talk more about that. But the dance forms are rather conventional. We have tambourin, menuet, and passe-pied. So these are dance forms that were already popular like from late 17th century. So that would be really interesting to know whether these dances incorporated some kind of folk steps. We have a polska there, so it'd be interesting, but I don't think that they would actually be real folk dances. They were probably like elevated to this, to something towards court dancing or towards like minuet step, passe-pied step, but there must have been like some flavor of the folk dances. So we can just speculate how that was.
Yes, absolutely. But it's very interesting to speculate, and I think, I mean, elevating is the word here for also taking these really traditional tunes, which we also find in the vocal music. We have tunes that travel from the folk music, and they get elevated, and they are still part of a living tradition in one way or another today, in many ways. Yeah, okay. Soon we will hear more music, but before we do so, Mark and Magnus, shall we just dig a little bit deeper into the actual music?
Yes, Mark, I thought you could tell us about maybe these borrowings of folk music that Petra has talked about in relation to the dancing. So there's the Vingåker dance, which is like a regional dance, and other folk songs in it. But what does it do with the music, with these folk tunes?
Well, I think this is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole piece, because you've, as already Petra has mentioned and Susanne's alluded to, there is this sense of bringing styles together. And I think when we look at this in also the broader perspective of the late 18th century operatic vocal music, we see the way in which many composers were working with the kind of same stock material, and they were then bringing their own inventive energies to bear upon the music which they heard around them. That music was sometimes actually written by themselves, sometimes it was written by other people, and sometimes it was folk music. And I mean, to give you an example, which is all I really wanted to do from this, we have, which is this Vingåkersdans, which is a dance that comes from Vingåker. It's a bruddans, it's a wedding dance. And what we see that Uttini does, which I think is really very interesting, is that he takes the dance melody itself, which you will hear, and just so that you recognise it, I will actually, I don't know if I can be seen now, but anyway, I'm going to be heard. I'll just play the beginning of the melody from the instrument here. So, which is then repeated, and then we have. So we have that simple melody. I mean, maybe some of you here in the audience or listening online already know that melody. It was new for me. But then what Uttini does, when he has to write music to be sung, as in this dance is this Hög Lorne, and when he has to write music for that, instead of writing the music to the actual dance, which is, he writes. So it's kind of that you have the flavour of the original folk dance in your ears. We can mix to the senses, as Jen has already told us that Gustav wanted to do. And with that flavour, you think, oh yeah, well, it just kind of, it merges into something else. And when we play it later on, and Elizabeth will, of course, sing the dance, and you'll see the dancers dancing the song, so it's also bringing it all together. You will get the idea of how skillful Uttini was at kind of merging these styles. And we try to suggest a little bit of the folk music style. It's also there in the instrumentation as well, in the dance. And then when it gets into the aria, then it sort of just goes away a little bit, and it becomes more like, I feel like a kind of Midsummer Night's Dream. And something else which is very interesting, I think, is that the text that is sung, which you will hear. I shall try to read it in Swedish now, and one of my colleagues here, I'm hoping, is going to try and translate it, because it says, Icke blott i hov sjungs deras lov, men och bland bygden Skara. Who wants to have a go at translating that?
Well, you don't only sing at the court, but also in the
out in the villages.
Yeah, out in the villages.
Yeah.
Out in the countryside.
And then the second half is only 2 lines. I våra käll, which was the new word for me, as a non-Swede. Prisar man sig själv att de sin nit förklara.
Yeah, in their little houses, cottages, abodes. Thank you.
Yeah.
they give praise.
Prisar man sig själv att de sin nit förklara.
Yeah, it's. I mean, in our history, I mean, we were striving for the better, and you know, that was a call. How would you say?
They will become happy, but singing and, you know, helping out to celebrate.
Yeah.
But I mean, do you think that there's, because what I see here is in the same way that the folk music and the court music is being brought together in some way, that this text is also saying that even sort of within society at that time, there is this sense in which things are going to come together, and it's an art, this opera, which is bringing together people and music from different traditions. So I see that's an example of what Uttini does here, and I think that's very inspiring. It's something we can even imagine doing today.
Does it become more courtly in a sense that that's my impression when you play that it becomes.
Yes, it does. It's this same elevation that we've talked about. It does lift up, and of course that's a cultural political phenomenon today that we might want to say: do we lift up or do we come down? We've talked about dumbing down, and I think it's fair to say that this is not dumbing down. Let's not go further than that. It's not dumbing down.
But I would want to ask you a bit about this kind of the elevation, and that's about that Uttini went out of fashion. Quite early. I mean, he was in his around 50 and in early 50s, and then from 78 he wanted to retire, and he was not allowed to because the king wanted to use him. And then he invited these German composers, Naumann and Krauss, Vogler and Hefner, to Stockholm, and then they revived Uttini's works like 15 years later, 1790. And I found 2 reviews of these revivals, including Birger, Jarl, and they're quite negative. And you can see that the fashion has changed.
Yeah.
And I thought I would read first the review of Birger Jarl from 1790, and it says, "Those who saw the piece performed in 1774 were able to judge the extent to which the acting had improved since that time, 16 years ago. The music includes some pretty numbers, but musical taste has generally undergone a major change. The Italian lengthiness and the French trills are out of fashion." And then the following year, Iphigenie, which was another piece by Uttini, was revived, and probably the same critic wrote in Stockholm's Posten, "We might have had cause to wish that the music for these choruses had been more suited to the present taste in the present moment, that it had been less lengthy and more differentiated, solemn, highly expressive. For without wanting to diminish the honor the slightest which appertained to the composer in another time, one must, however, admit that the great revolution that has since occurred in dramatic music has accustomed both ears and judgment to greater expectations, even with us, that is in Sweden." And I thought that was interesting that he. What was that change that happened? Why do you think this would have been out of fashion a few years later, and why?
Well, I mean, we need another King and the Academy to discuss that, really. But just very briefly, what I think is that for us today, we have an ability to appreciate music from all kind of different styles in the past. We don't say, "Oh, that's very outmoded," because we are out of that situation. But when we think of it historically and in terms of the 18th century, then we can see that the music of Krauss and of Hefner and Naumann, it has the drama put right inside the music, so that it becomes. I mean, we've talked about a drama with music. You could say that it becomes music drama, and I think that's the difference. This is still, to all intents and purposes, a play with music, even though the music itself is very, very expressive. And like we heard in so far the only piece we've heard, I hope we'll be able to play more in a minute. There's plenty of opportunity for illustrating the music on stage with action, and it's extremely skillfully written. But the actual drama doesn't get into the music in the same way as these later composers, with their Gluckian influences and so on, were able to bring. I think I'll leave it there for now.
Yeah, well, we are dying to hear some more music, and there were 2 sopranos, at least, in the first performance, but I would like to highlight 2 of them. We had Elisabeth Olin. She was actually also the first woman to become a member of the Royal Swedish Academy. in 1782. And then we had Lovisa Augusti, member number 106, and elected in 1788. She was the daughter of a Jewish musician, and I'm recalling to what you said, I mean, that he, Gustavus III, had a very strong sense for talent. And supposedly he heard her sing in Kristianstad and brought her immediately to Stockholm. And she made her debut at the Stockholm Opera in 1773 and could shortly thereafter then be heard in Birger Jarl. And here we have not Lovisa Augusti, but we have Elisabeth Hellström, and we will hear one of the arias from Birger Jarl.
And before you hear it, I'm afraid we're just going to do a little bit of we love doing that tuning.
Exactly. to balance the review that you read, I thought I'd read something which was written in honor to Lovisa Augusti after the performance, and this was actually then the part of Eglé. And this is in Swedish. I have not translated it, so please enjoy just old Swedish language if you are an English-speaking person. När jag, Eglé, på scenen skådar, når jag den vackra stämma hör. Sig både syn och hörsel bådar att hon min ömma känsla rör. Naturens enfald synes vinna av konstens reglor nytt behag, ja, både dubbel styrka finna och lyfta i dess skönsta dag. Lik Tetis, då hon vill behaga, så är Eglé och i sitt spel. Hon vet den konsten att intaga, och 1000 lovord är det del. Dess täcka ungdom artigt lyser ut av dess spel och sköna sång, och allt vad själen känslor hyser förtjusas alla på en gång. So, just to obviously they did enjoy it at the time, and they did enjoy the singer very, very much, as well as the music. But Mark, just briefly, what are the biggest challenges today if we want to I wouldn't say recreate, but to perform this piece? What are the
1 minute on the biggest challenges.
Or two maybe.
I think the biggest challenge is in a way is to be aware of what Magnus was saying, and to look the music sort of square in the eye and in the face and say, yeah, this music is for us very new, but we know that at the time it had been considered old, and that's something that we are very familiar with. We all know, not just in the Swedish repertoire of Krauss and Naumann and so on, but also internationally with the works of Gluck and Mozart and so on. We know another style. So what is it that we can bring? What can we take out of this music when we're rehearsing it? What can we find as musicians and singers, dancers, whatever category we happen to be in, that we think would really bring pleasure to an audience today? We were joking a little bit that earlier on the drama around it is very difficult to perform today. It's with a lot of old Swedish, very long and so on. So we have to think, what can we do with that? How can we do that? Or is it only interesting in the history books? But I think from the point of view of the music, it's that challenge of making every single moment, every part of it, not just a dance movement or this comes from here, but what does it actually mean? And try to really almost exaggerate the connection that the music has with what's going on stage. Because the essence of Gustavian opera, in my view, is the essence of all good opera, which is where you get a meeting of storytelling and music in front of an audience, and with singing when there is singing, and that it all comes together in something very united, not bits that are put together. So we come full circle from all the sources that come, put together, but they make a whole, and that whole is what we think of as being the operatic moment, or an opera experience, whatever name we call it, comedy, ballet, or play with music, and that it's that will really move an audience today. And I think that's what we want to try to do with the music, and that's the challenge.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, we have a job to do, but we have another year to prepare it.
Yes.
And hopefully we'll have a full picture, a full performance that will touch people's hearts in a year from now. And I really like what we mentioned before, bringing people together. I mean, that's what we need to do in any time, really. So that will be very exciting to follow the work towards that moment, and dancing towards that moment, using the gestures, using the costumes, and have that interact as well. And Petra, I know you have some beautiful sketches and drawings that will also intrigue us. So please, I give the word to you now.
Thank you. I actually start with text because we were speaking about like potential performance, or the for sure performance that will happen next year. And I think that will be from choreographic and also like stage costume-wise very interesting challenge because as I said, like second half 18th century, the dance has, like, we speak a lot about genres, but choreographically it's still a lot of discussion about like how it actually looked like. There's a lot of writing that it became very difficult, that it became, you know, very pantomimic, and but we have no notations, or very little notations from that period. We have a lot of notations from beginning of 18th century, and then, as some of the choreographers said, dance just became too difficult to notate. So, and they stopped. And that's unfortunately the situation that we are like right now. But also it's very interesting to talk about like how the Lappar danced, how the Dalarna people danced with this, like when we spoke about the elevated style. And from the costume perspective, there are actually inventories of the costumes, not from the first performance, but from some court performance where only the courtiers of surrounding Gustav III performed, probably at Gripsholm, maybe Drottningholm, around 1786. And so we can get like a really good idea of what it looked like, or like what were the materials, what were the colors. And I love the inventories because they really show like unexpected things about the costume. But I can like develop a little bit later, but because stage costume was always something else than clothing, like in the city or at the court. It was somehow related, always related to the fashion of the time or to the dress of the time, but it was always theatrical in some way. There was difference between costumes for dancing and between costumes and costumes for singing, obviously, because dancers need to move. They cannot have a long trail behind them, because that would be dangerous. So these things also very much reflect, and then of course I spoke already about the character, the genre, and that was all very connected. The dance, the role, and what their costume was like, it was very intertwined. So if I can move on, we don't have, unfortunately, more visuals about Birger, like from the original performance. We only know that Carlo Galli-Bibbiena was invited, which is Italian designer. He was invited specifically for this show. So it was not Jean-Éric Rydén, who was the designer of the period at the court, but Carlo Galli-Bibbiena, and Rydén was obviously, he was very angry about this. So he was like swearing all around the castle that he doesn't get to design this. But it was Galli-Bibbiena who did the job, and this design is not from the opera, but it is an interior in Gothic style, which is one of the suggestions for this stage design of the first and third, I think, act. So maybe the stage drop was something like that. But then there was also Princess de Navarre as an inspiration, the French design, and I have to say that French design, or like French influence, was maybe the strongest in the Swedish design from the beginning. It was also obviously Jean Bérin, which was designer during the reign of Louis XIV, the Sun King. We have a lot of designs preserved in Swedish archives, so they were like brought to Sweden to serve as an inspiration. And there were of course later designers as well, like Louis-René Bocquet, who designed the costumes for La Princesse de Navarre. So here we have one of the, I think he's astrologist, and so we can imagine the soothsayers might have looked a little bit similar, because they described like having a long coat with some magical characters written on the sides. So you can see that a little bit there. Often they had like this tall hat. And here we have Sanchet, which is this 18th century version of 14th century dress. So In this period, historical realism of costumes was not at all the main concept of design, so to speak. So the characters, nations, and historical time should be represented in a believable and plausible way for the local audience, but not exceeding the decency and the manners of the local audience. That is why the reference to history or to nation or to region, in this case when we have the regional dress, had to be balanced with the local fashionable dress. Realistic reproduction would be considered either indecent or ridiculous or simply boring. So that was not interesting. Also, I should say that in the case of court performances and also Paris Opera, but also here the Royal Opera, they would also elevate in the terms of fabrics. So as you see here, it's all silk. So that is not like a peasant dress as they were in 18th century, but it was like a version of, like an elevated version. So again, we are here in this mode of elevation. I try to move to the next picture. Again, bouquet. And this is from the opera Aigle. We also spoke about it as another inspiration from France. And here you can see characters like Aigle, the main shepherdess, Plaisir, Amour, Cupid. So you can get this idea of a noble style with their kind of courtly dress with a lot of drapery, which is also something very theatrical. To have this drapery which then like turns when you turn like a dancer, and then of course they have these attributes like the flower garlands, and we can see that in the descriptions of the costumes for Birger, so the pleasures and the games, they had these flower garlands all around them, and of course there was Cupid with all his props that he needs to do what he does. And then you can see Jouerie, that is plays and smiles, or games and smiles. That's another allegorical character that was also in Birger. And here we can see like this typical serious costume. So as I was speaking about the genres in dance, this related to the genres in costume. So you see the men on the left side having the tonnelle, the short skirt, and the women having quite wide skirts, which at the time was already considered like neither historical nor necessary nor like practical for dancing, but it was the sign for the serious genre. And then I would like to show this last French inspiration, again bouquet and workshop, from a kind of demi-character or even comic type of costume. So you have this pastourelle, so pastors. This could be similar for villagers or for peasants. They would like suggest the character of a peasant through, like, for example, the front lacing. You see that it's different from the previous designs, or the use of a hat, or the use of an apron, like I have. And there is no tonnelle for the male dancing, because of course the comic dances are, as I said, much more there's much more expensive movements, more jumps, maybe higher legs as well, higher arms. So they need to be free to do that. So that's why they also need to have different dress. And I try to go to next slide. Yes. Here we can see the actual Swedish designs preserved in the Royal Opera and also in Berlingga archive, which, as you know, you compare to what I just shown you, it is very similar. So there is quite clear French inspiration, even if these are later. And here, this is also French inspiration. There are similar designs like this from Jean Béran from 17th century, but these are actually made by Gustav III. So he was also, as we said, very inspired, and also himself giving not only like word instructions, but even like designing to give an idea. So he was like leading the hand and sometimes even like drawing for everybody. I think this is really beautiful.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, and then it's a little bit moved. I'm so sorry for this. I don't know if we can do something about it, but yes, I was speaking about the French inspiration, but then I also said that it was Italian who was actually invited to design this. So we don't have any designs from Bibbiena, but I choose this design from Leonardo Marini, who was actually costume designer to Bibbiena's sometimes in Italy, in Turin. So he was like specialized in costume design, they did the stage. So here we can see this 18th century version of a medieval knight. And when we compare it to the inventory that I mentioned in the beginning, it is quite similar. So there would be like the armor, the harness, simulated by fabric. So it was not actual harness, but it was simulated by fabric. And then he had like some vest above and a cape. You can see also that he actually had two costumes because he was disguising, right? So he needed another costume. The other costume was much more royal. There was like hermine all around it. So you can see how what it might have looked like on the stage. And maybe just to close, I have some designs which are later by Swedish designers. This is actually also, the plot is happening in medieval times, but it is a design for the carousel planned for 1782, planned by Gustav III again, and this time it was actually designed, or the costumes were designed by Sergel. But this carousel never happened, so we don't even know if the costumes were made. But we know that other costumes were made. Jean-Louis Deprez became court designer in 1786, and I think Gustav III actually brought him personally. He is French, but he brought him from Italy where they met, and it's like, you make my costumes. And then he did this kind of Swedish national, not Swedish national dress, because that was Gustav III who made it himself, but this is like a version of a historical Swedish dress. This is for Gustav Vasa in 86, and you can see that this was something like it looked like. These are actually preserved costume from a carousel, not from the performance, but this is called Burgundian costume, and it became like the symbol for this historical Swedish place. And they are inspired by actual like historical clothes that are preserved in Livrustkammaren, the Royal Swedish Library, from 15th, 14th century. So he had like direct inspiration, Gustav III, and he would just go and see clothes of his ancestors to get inspiration for his 18th century version of it. Yes.
Fantastic. It's so interesting. Well, we've been able just to touch on the surface, that's my feeling, to all of this. But thank you so much, everyone, for this. We've been moving, and we will be moving through times and through styles in a comedy ballet for all senses. Isn't that a nice way to think of Birger Jarl and the upcoming performance? We will, of course, end with music, and not only music, but also dancing. Petra, you're already dressed, and we have a companion, and I'd like Mark to come in and come there. Yes. We will need to move our chairs and give a place for you, and during that time, Mark will tell us a little bit about what we are to experience. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you got a little taste and interest for what is to come.
slow minuet, called slow minuet, but it's quite a fast minuet in one sense. And then the idea of the Wingorkish dance comes back, but this time it comes back in its psalm form, so you'll notice the difference. And then after it, there's like a kind of echo of the original Wingorkish dance, and it concludes with a short passe-pied. So this is really a compilation that Rydén put together, and that we have tried to recreate for you. Well, we have recreated it, we've tried, and I think succeeded to recreate for you today. And we've met the musicians. This is Peter, you've already met, in a guise as a researcher, and now she is in a guise as a dancer. And then there is Camilla Candare, who will be joining, well, who is actually the lead dancer.
I also want to say something about the dances.
Yes, do you want to say? Yes.
So this was a bit last minute compilation, as Mark said. So these are by no means dances from 1770s. Camilla actually, she's also a dance scholar, so she chose choreographies that were notated in the beginning of the 18th century that fit the music actually quite perfectly. And they are from Kellum Tomlinson collection from 1716, and they were actually theatrical dances. So they were performed within a piece which was called The Island Princess in London. So in a sense it fits, but the choreography, of course, it's just a suggestion according to the pieces and the type of the dance, the minuet and tambour.
That's it.